Welcome. Let's start this lesson with a quick warm-up. Pick one of the two equations and solve it by completing the square. All right, pause me and then come back when you're done. Here are the two solutions. I've also demonstrated writing the solutions in two different ways. Here I'm writing it as two separate values for x, and here I'm writing it as saying -2 plus or minus the square root of 10 over 2. All right, if you got different solutions, then please pause me, find and fix your error, and or come and ask me a question during class to make sure you get that resolved. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. Now let's start the lesson by seeing how the quadratic formula connects with the other techniques you already know how to use. Now we'll start with the square root method. Now the square root method is really, it just uses basic equation solving strategies that allow you to isolate the variable. So nothing new there. Now the problem with the square root method is that it can only be used to solve specific types of equations. Enter completing the square. Now completing the square allows us to convert any quadratic equation into an equivalent equation that can be solved using the square root method. So this equation right here, when I complete the square, gives me an equation that I can solve using the square root method. Now I've got to be honest, mathematicians love completing the square. It's just so strangely satisfying. But we also love to be efficient and to generalize. So one day, a mathematician took a generalized quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and solved for x by completing the square. Now, the general solutions she found were x is equal to -b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, sometimes people like to write the quadratic formula as a single fraction. So if we add those fractions together, they have a common denominator. It would just look like this. This is probably the more common way that you'd see the quadratic formula, but in some ways, I think this one is going to give us a lot more information along the way. Now, the quadratic formula, because it's simply completing the square, but it's just done ahead of time, it can be used to solve any quadratic equation. Now, hopefully, I'm hoping you're like, I'm kind of curious. How did that really smart mathematician go from this general form of the quadratic equation and complete the square to get down here? If you're curious about that, you have two options. Go back to the playlist item number 4.3, extend your thinking, and give it a go for yourself, or go watch the video that I put together that's called Deriving the Quadratic Formula, and we'll walk through those steps. Let's try an example just to see the quadratic formula in action. Watch out though. You can only use the quadratic formula if one side of your equation is set equal to 0. So that's always a first step to take. All right, so here we have a quadratic equation. For this, we know a is equal to 2, b is equal to 8, and c is equal to 3. Great, we can just decode that. All right, what's our quadratic formula? How much of it do you remember? X is equal to -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right, so actually using the quadratic formula is just a matter of substituting your values for the variable and doing a little bit of arithmetic. So let's substitute -8 plus or minus 8 squared minus 4 times 2 times 3 all over 2 times 2. All right, let's do our arithmetic. -8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 24 all over 4, and x is equal to -8 plus or minus the square root of 40 over 4. Now, to be honest, right at this point, we have our two solutions. What we're going to do for the remaining of this is just simplifying. All right, so the first thing I want to handle is I want to simplify my radical. I see it has a perfect square factor of 4, excuse me. So plus or minus 2 times the square root of 10 over 4. At this point, I'm going to distribute division. So I have negative 8 divided by 4 plus or minus 2 square root 10 divided by 4. And x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 10 over 2. One of the reasons I like to write the solution like this is it gives me a good visual. If I have a number line, here's 0. I'm going to start at negative 2. And let's see, square root of 10 over 2. Square root of 10 is a little bit more than 3 divided by 2. So it's like plus or minus about 3 halves. So plus 3 halves would bring me to the first solution, minus about 3 halves would give me to the second solution. All right, we're going to end with 2 practice problems. Pause me, solve both using the quadratic formula, and then come back to check your answers. Here are the solutions to the 2 equations. If you have any additional questions, please come and ask me in class.